All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody attending. Welcome, Dr. Chris Mato Nunpa, who will be speaking to us about the great evil, Christianity, the Bible, and Native American genocide. Dr. Chris Mato Nunpa, PhD, is a former associate professor of Indigenous Nations and Dakota Studies at Southwest Minnesota State University. Professor Mato Nunpa holds a PhD in higher education administration from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus, with the collateral field for the PhD in American Indian Studies. He also studied theology at Seabury Western Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. Dr. Chris Mato Nunpa is a Wapetuan Dwellers in the Leaves or Wahpeton Dakota from the Pezuhuta Zizi Otunwe. I hope I did not butcher that.
Not bad.
Yellow medicine community in southwestern Minnesota. And we are so excited to have him here. I'm not going to talk much longer. I'm just going to give you a few instructions. I'm Paige. She, her, and they, them pronouns. I'm on the board of Million Artists Movement. I will be helping to make sure that the technology runs smoothly. And after this, this talk will be uploaded online, probably YouTube, and we'll share the recording so that you can rewatch it. You can share it widely, share it with all your friends, with your family, with your auntie, with your grandma, everybody. And Alizarin is also on the board of Million Artists Movement. She will be monitoring the chat for your questions throughout Dr. Mato Nunpa's talk, and then we'll make sure we get back to them when he's done speaking. All right, I'll hand it over to you, Chris. Welcome.
Thank you, Paige. And I also want to publicly thank Maria Asp for making the connection from me to you guys over there in the Million Artists Movement. Genocide, the Bible, and atrocities, killing women, children, babies, and elders. Quotation, raising and destroying enemy villages and fields, killing women and children, raiding settlements for captives, intimidating and brutalizing non-combatants, and assassinating enemy leaders. In the frontier wars between 1607 and 1814, white Americans forged two elements, unlimited war and irregular war, into their first way of war. A quotation from John Grenier in his book, The First Way of War. When I wrote my book, The Great Evil, it was based on my three research interests: Indigenous Nation studies, genocide studies, and biblical studies. Also, as I studied, read, and took courses for both my master's degree in 1971 and my PhD in 1974 at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus, I learned much about the Native history of this country, the United States of America, and I learned about the violence, the land theft, the broken treaties, the genocide, etc. In the hundreds of genocidal massacres which occurred to our First Nations peoples in the first 4 centuries the white man was here, I read about the Bible verses and the biblical allusions that were made and quoted by the white killers as they slaughtered our women, children, babies, and elders, along with the men. I thought to myself, geez, I need to write about this and let the world know, and future generations of Dakota Indigenous children know what was done to our Indigenous peoples and who did it. And I try to interweave my knowledge from my three research interests in the narrative of what I considered the great evil that was perpetrated by the US government and its US Euro-American citizenry and the Euro-Minnesotan citizenry. And so I present the Bible verses which were used to justify, number one, murdering Native peoples, Anywhere from 16 to 18 million indigenous people slaughtered in 4 centuries. Number 2, stealing all of our lands, approximately 3 billion acres of land, according to Trafzer in his book, As Long as the Rivers Flow and the Grass Shall Grow. And number 3, criminalizing and suppressing our religious ceremonies and spirituality, contrary to the white man's sacred document, the US Constitution, the First Amendment. And number 4, enslaving our indigenous peoples. I will focus on particular atrocities which involve the murdering of women, children, babies, and elders, along with the Bible verses in which Yahweh, the Old Testament Jewish God, commands these atrocious murders. These are subjects which in general are not taught in any of the white schools, universities, and colleges, both public and private, because they are so damning to the US government and its white citizenry and would not encourage US nationalism and patriotism. As David Bolin writes, quote, "The best interests of white American philosophy of education would not be served if third graders were taught that during the 19th century, the American farmer was perhaps the most ruthless and relentless exterminator of the Indians, or that the white American frontiersmen, cowboys, and soldiers often excelled in their use of barbaric torture, brutality, and slaughter in their encounters with Indians." This is from David Bolin, North America, The Blind Spot in History, written in November of 1969. Background statements. However, before I go into the book, Bible Verses and Atrocities, I would like to make some background statements. My first statement is in regard to perspective. Since I am an indigenous person and a Dakota man, I do not come from a Western European or a US Euro-American or a Euro-Minnesotan point of view. I come from a Dakota perspective specifically, and from an indigenous perspective generally. Example, when the white man says, "We settle the land," we, the Dakota and other indigenous peoples, might say, no, the white man stole the lands. Furthermore, he didn't pay for the lands either. Now, statement number 2, I dislike and generally do not use the following terms except if the terms are used in sentences which I am quoting. For example, Indian. I despise that term. It's a colonial imposition. The term Indian obscures the richness and diversity of indigenous cultures and societies. Besides, we as First Nations peoples are not from India. B, I say, instead of tribe, I say people or nation. Nations and peoples make treaties, not tribes. And our people made over 400 plus treaties with the indigenous peoples, made over 400 plus treaties with the United States of America, which were made and broken by the United States. And thirdly, I do not use the term Sioux. We are not an enemy or a snake, which that term connotes. Dakota, our name for ourselves, means friend or ally. Fourthly, I do not use the term Native American because it is inaccurate. I used to ask students in my courses when I was teacher, quote, "How many of you were born in the United States?" Invariably, most of the students, with the exception for students from other countries, would raise their hands, and then I would say, "Congratulations, you all are Native Americans." To me, if anyone is born here in indigenous homelands in what is now the United States of America, you are a Native American. And I hated that term, but the publisher put that term in the title of my book. And fifthly, also, I do not generally use the term American, nor do I identify as an American because of what the white Americans did to our native peoples, killing us by the millions, stealing all of our indigenous homelands, breaking all our treaties, et cetera, et cetera. And sixthly, I use indigenous or native, First Nations or Aboriginal to refer to the peoples who were here when the invaders, killers, destroyers, and exploiters came to indigenous homelands in the indigenous hemisphere in 1492. 3, on page 2 of The Great Evil is a sentence which reads, as with the Genocide Project, it was a time of mass killing. The killing fields were the entire expanse of what is now known as the United States of America. About 98.5% of the 16 million indigenous peoples of the US at the time of contact, 1500, had been systematically killed off. By 1900, there was only 237,000 or so Aboriginal peoples left, according to the 1990 US Bureau of Census. This is an extermination rate of 98.5%, an incredible killing efficiency. Dr. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz writes in her book, North America is a crime scene. North America is a crime scene. Another writer, Jody Bird, writes, the story of the New World is horror. The story of America, a crime. And Dunbar Ortiz further says, it is necessary to start with the origin of the United States as a settler state and its explicit intention to occupy the continent. These origins contain the historical seeds of genocide. Any true history of the United States must focus on what has happened to and with indigenous peoples and what still happens. And that's from an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and page 228 of her book. Atrocities, Ray, the killing of women, children, babies, and elders. Now, on to what I really want to discuss today. That is, I wish to present what was done to the indigenous peoples of what is now known as the United States of America and who did it. We already know that it was the US government and its military and its Euro-American citizenry, farmers, settlers, cowboys, frontiersmen, editors, etc., who perpetrated genocide and all the atrocities which accompanied the murder and extermination of First Nations peoples. And it began with a man whose holiday who used to be celebrated by indigenous peoples and by some of our white allies. In the first grade at Granite Falls Public Schools, Minnesota, in 1947, I learned about Columbus. I think for the first time, because I don't remember my folks talking about Columbus. I learned the poem, which includes the line, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I remembered the white female teacher saying that Columbus was a hero because he, quote, discovered America, unquote, and that he was a good man because he was a Christian. In my college years and in my graduate studies for the master's and the PhD, I learned that what the teachers at the Granite Falls Elementary School and at the junior high school and at the senior high school were not only inaccurate, but also they were lies. Here are 3 atrocities out of many which Columbus and his soldiers committed against the First Nations people. The first one, burning people alive at the stake. On page 62 of my book, The Great Evil, we see Hatui being burned alive at the stake. Columbus and his soldiers found Hatui and his people and killed most of them and enslaved the others. slavery began with Columbus, and condemned their leader to be burned alive. Dr. David Standard, in his book, American Holocaust, chronicles the event. Quote, reportedly, as they were tying him, that is Hatui, to the stake, a Franciscan friar urged him to take Jesus to his heart so that his soul might go to heaven rather than descend into hell. Hatui replied that if heaven was where the Christians went, he would rather go to hell. A brave but wise man. This was a common practice of the Roman Catholic Church and its zealous adherents to burn people alive at the stake, and Columbus and his soldiers were no exception. Number two, hanging 13 native peoples at a time, and that's found on page 61 of the book, The Great Evil. Quote, the Spaniards found pleasure in inventing all kinds of odd cruelties. The more cruel, the better. They built a long gibbet, which is like a scaffold, low enough for the toes to touch the ground and prevent strangling, and hanged 13 natives at a time in honor of Jesus Christ, our Savior, and the 12 apostles. Again, David Standard, American Holocaust, page 70 of his book. Imagine that. How do Christians who are supposed to have the love of God and love of Jesus in their hearts and to show mercy and to forgive, and yet at the same time perpetrate genocide and all manner of torture and cruelty? Apparently, they are not aware of their cognitive dissonance. Number three, David E. Standard mentioned above in his book, American Holocaust. He writes that Columbus and his soldiers used ferocious armored dogs that had been trained to kill and disembowel the native peoples, forcing them to supply food and women and slaves. They killed indiscriminately the natives they encountered. The troops would steal, kill, rape, and torture the indigenous peoples. The natives had their hands cut off if they didn't bring in their 3-month quota of gold. Quote, they would test their swords and their manly strength on captured First Nations peoples and place bets on the slicing off of heads or the cutting of bodies in half with one blow. They burned or hanged captured chiefs. They tore babies from their mother's breast and dashed their heads against the rocks, unquote. This incident reminds me of a Bible verse, Psalms 137, verses 1, 8, and 9. Quote, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. A blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. This is from the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures, 1985. This genocidal sentiment from the Bible is what Dr. Philip Jenkins would characterize a text of terror. And there's many of them, texts of terror in the Old Testament in particular, and a couple in the New Testament. Jenkins' book is Laying Down the Sword, Why We Can't Ignore the Bible's Violent Verses, written in 2011. Another thing Jenkins says is, quote, biblical violence is often marked by indiscriminate savagery. Also, Jenkins has a section in his book titled The Most Disturbing Conquest Texts. And I would call that the most disturbing genocidal texts, because they talk about killing and exterminating. Back to Columbus, to test the sharpness of their blades, and this is in another incident, They began to rip open the bellies to cut and kill men, women, children, and old folk, all of whom were seated, off guard and frightened. Not a man of all of them remained alive. They killed all of them. In the hundreds of genocidal massacres that were perpetrated against the indigenous peoples on the mainland in the first 4 centuries, beginning with 1492, the indiscriminate killing of women, children, babies, and elders was routine. It was not an aberration. It was routine. It was regular. One oral history tells of white soldiers taking Dakota babies and dashing their heads against a tree or rock and throwing their bodies into the water, either the Minnesota River or the Mississippi. Back in 1862, with the Dakota-US War and the aftermath, especially on the forced march of 1,700 of our women, children, babies, and elders on November 7th through the 13th, 1862, when they were imprisoned at the Fort Snelling concentration camp for 6 months in a cold Minnesota winter from November 1862 through April 1863. Hundreds died of cold, exposure, hunger, disease, or murder during this bitterly cold Minnesota winter of 1862, 1863. I had a grandmother who was in the forced march back in November of 1862. And she was stabbed in the stomach by a soldier on horseback and stabbed her with his saber. Her sin was not understanding a command in a foreign language, English, the order to move on. Then her body was thrown into the water. We have no idea where her body is. Thus, we have no closure. And we, the family and relatives, carry this historical trauma with us to this day in the year 2021, an incident which happened 159 years ago in November 1862. Hopefully, the listener is getting an idea of the cruelty, barbarism, and savagery of Columbus, supposedly a Christian. He was a good Roman Catholic, and his soldiers in their genocidal and evil treatment of the native peoples of the Caribbean. In 21 years, 8 million First Nations peoples were slaughtered by Columbus and his men. The native people had been, quote, killed by violence, disease, and despair from Standard's American Holocaust, Roman numeral X or 10. To provide a perspective, the figure of 8 million killed is 2 million more than the 6 million Jews killed by Hitler and the Nazis in the Jewish Shoah. Eventually, anywhere from 16 to 18 million indigenous peoples were victims of genocide on the mainland perpetrated by the US government and its Western European and its US Euro-American citizenry. This caused Standard to write the following: the destruction of the Indians of the Americas was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. And this is worth repeating. The destruction of the Indians of the Americas was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. So listeners out there, whenever the term genocide is mentioned, please think about the native peoples of the Americas that were slaughtered in the greatest genocide ever in the history of the world. The Pequot Holocaust. On May 26, 1637, the Christian English made a stealthy night attack on a stockaded Pequot town on the Mystic River in Connecticut. The whites attacked the town, setting fire to it, slaying men, women, and children and elders as they fled the flames and slaughtered its 700 plus inhabitants. Dr. Ward Churchill writes that the number of Pequots fried in the fire or bayoneted by the good Christian killers was closer to 900. This figure would include the women, children, babies, elders, along with the men. The killers regarded this mass killing of the Pequots by fire as a sacrifice to God, similar to the Old Testament killing of a lamb or ram by fire as a sweet smelling sacrifice to God for the sins of the people. There is a number of such Bible verses regarding the killing of sheep as a sacrifice to Yahweh, the Old Testament Jewish God, which were quoted during the time of the murdering. For example, out of many, Leviticus 8:21 reads, quote, "And Moses burnt the whole ram upon the altar. It was a burnt sacrifice for a sweet savor and an offering made by fire unto the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses." The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Jewish scriptures, and written in 1962 and revised in 1967, says, Moses turned all of the ram into smoke on the altar. That was a burnt offering for a pleasing odor and offering by fire to the Lord. The meaning of this verse in both versions is very clear. The burning of the ram was an act of worship to Yahweh or to God. It is apparent that the Christian English considered, quote, in a similar grisly way, the burning by fire of the Pequot people was literally a sweet sacrifice and produced a sweet and pleasing odor unto the Lord. Amen. Praise the Lord. Sarcasm. Listen to the statement of William Bradford as he described the conflagration which burned hundreds upon hundreds of Pequots in the fire. Quote, this is William Bradford again. "It was a fearful sight to see them frying in the fire and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the praise thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hand and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy." William Bradford, a descendant of the historical William Bradford, is today a champion of Indigenous peoples, perhaps atoning for his ancestors' cruel and genocidal attitude, question mark? Note Bradford's phrase, "to see them frying in the fire." This is a reference to the women, children, babies, and elders who were consumed in the flames. Many of the men were out hunting for food. The streams of blood refer to the blood of the women, children, babies, and elders who were non-combatants, who were innocents. Also note the pious English Christians giving praise thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them. This particular phrase is found in 1 Samuel 6:6, in which Bradford is referring to the deliverance of the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt. In both instances, God was helping the Israelites and also the symbolic Israelites, that is, the English Christian soldiers who were marching off to war against the Pequots and slaughtering the women, children, babies, and elders. In regard to the killing of non-combatants and innocents, listen to the quotation of John Underhill, a partner in crime to John Mason, who reassured his fellow killers that, quote, "Sometimes the scripture declareth women and children must perish with their parents. And that just because the women and children are vulnerable, weak, helpless, and unarmed," quote, "did not make their deaths any less a delight to the Puritans' God." Here are a few verses out of many which illustrate the killing of women and children. And I don't think I'm going to read all of them, but there was about 5 of them here. So I'm going to read just the first one and the last one. Deuteronomy, 2nd chapter, verses 33, 34. "And the Lord our God delivered him, King Sihon and his people, the Amorites, and we utterly destroyed the men, women, and little ones, toddlers of every city. We left none remaining. And then I would like to quote this one, though. One of the most damning scriptures in this writer's perspective is found in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3, which reads, "Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child." But kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Here we see Yahweh, the Jewish God of the Old Testament, commanding the Israelites to kill not just the men, but also kill the infants, the babies, and the nursing child, and then all the animals. And a lot of times God would say, kill all that breatheth, or leave none alive that breatheth in these scriptures. There's about 6 genocidal commands of the Old Testament God that I found. They're part of the hidden Bible because most pastors don't want to talk about that, or priests. So I ask you out there who are listening, quote, what kind of God commands the killing of children, toddlers, and babies who are still nursing? The answer, an angry, genocidal killer God does. An angry, genocidal killer God does. The Wounded Knee Massacre. The Wounded Knee Massacre occurred on December 29th, 1890 in western South Dakota, where the Pine Ridge Reservation is located. Dr. Russell Thornton in his book characterized this atrocity as, quote, perhaps the best known genocide of North American Indians, unquote. And Thornton has written the book called American Indian Holocaust and Survival, written in 1987 on page 107. There, the US cavalry slaughtered anywhere from 350 to 375 Lakota people, human beings, men, women, children, babies, and elders, and were then left in the brutal South Dakota winter snows. Quote, the massacre was reminiscent of the Old Testament mass killings ordered by Yahweh, the cruel, angry, vindictive killer God of the Old Testament, to kill all that breatheth, to utterly exterminate, to leave no survivors. Ward Churchill, in his book, A Little Matter of Genocide, quotes a guy named Ralph Andress in his book, Long Death, quote, all witnesses agree from the moment it opened fire, the soldier ceased to be a military unit and became a mass of infuriated men intent on butchery. Women and children attempted to escape by running up a dry ravine, but were pursued and slaughtered. There is no other word by hundreds of maddened soldiers. The line of bodies afterward was found to extend more than 2 miles from the camp, and they were all women and children. Here was a line of bodies, 2 miles in length, and the bodies were all women and children. A few survivors eventually found shelter in brushy gullies here and there, and their pursuers had scouts call out that women and children could come out of hiding because there was nothing to fear. Some small boys crept out and were surrounded by soldiers who then butchered them. Nothing Indian that lived was safe. Note the statement, and they were all women and children. This harkens back to the Pequot Holocaust some 253 years before in 1637. Then again, John Underhill said, quote, sometimes the scripture declareth women and children must perish with their parents, unquote. These Christian English and other subsequent Christian soldiers knew well their Bible. Black Elk describes the scene thusly, quote, Dead and wounded women and children and little babies were scattered all along there where they had been trying to run away. Black Elk saw people who had been, quote, torn to pieces were the wagon guns. And these wagon guns were Hotchkiss machine guns, and when the guns hit them, they were just mowed down. I saw a little baby trying to suck its mother, but she was bloody and dead. Black Elk goes on to say, I saw many dead Lakota. I wished I had died too, but I was not sorry for the women and children. It was better for them to be happy in the other world, and I wanted to be there too. Such descriptions are heartrending and are almost too much to bear. Again, I wish to remind the listeners that it is important to remember that the Old Testament God commanded the mass killing of innocents, women, children, babies, and elders, the most vulnerable groups in any society. And another verse here, Deuteronomy 2:33 and 34, and the Lord our God delivered him over to us, and we utterly destroyed the men, the women, and the little ones. There was a racist, white supremacist, and racial hating guy, an editor, who urged the extermination of all US Native peoples. This guy wrote, quote, the nobility of the redskin is extinguished, and what few are left are a pack of whining curs who lick the hand that smites them. The whites, by law of conquest, by justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians. Why not annihilation? Their glory has fled, their spirit broken, their manhood effaced. Better that they should die than live the miserable wretches that they are, unquote. And as if that was not enough, this guy once more lifted up his figurative sword 4 days later and did mightily smite us. He wrote, quote, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth. And I just want to remind you that they had almost wiped us off the face of the earth by 1890, as it is. This man was just like the Old Testament God who called for utter extermination of the indigenous peoples of Canaan. Who was this guy anyway? Who was this genocidal God or guy? His name was L. Frank Baum, B-A-U-M, who was editor of the Aberdeen, South Dakota Saturday Pioneer, who was also the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and other children's books. Baum would fit right in with Yahweh's mass murdering barbarians, the Israelites, and with Columbus, and fit in with George Washington, with Thomas Jefferson, with Andrew Jackson, with the Reverend Colonel John Chivington, with Abraham Lincoln, with Theodore Roosevelt, with Donald Trump, and with other racist, white supremacists, racial haters, Republicans, and neo-Nazis. The Sand Creek Massacre, this will be the last massacre I'll talk about. The Sand Creek Massacre occurred on November 29th, 1864 in Colorado. The US Army, along with civilian Euro-Coloradans, did not spare the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples, put to death men and women, children, and infants. Even white witnesses say that about their fellow white soldiers, that they kill the children, babies, women, babies, and nursing babies, infants. The commander of the killer troops was Colonel John Chivington, who was also a Methodist minister. So anybody Methodist out there? Is he a hero for you? Reverend Colonel John Chivington? An incidental comment. Reportedly, Chivington was a 6'4", 260-pound man when he would preach, would place his two pistols on either side of the Bible on the lectern of the Denver Methodist Church and, quote, then proceed to dispense with either hot hell or hot lead, unquote. The Reverend Colonel Shivington and his troops butchered approximately 500 Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly old men, women, children, infants, and toddlers. I suspect that the Reverend Shivington and his men regarded the native peoples of the indigenous hemisphere, the Cheyenne and Arapaho in this case, as uncivilized, pagans, infidels, barbarians, savages, and who needed to come out of their heathen darkness into the marvelous light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Furthermore, they would actually believe that they were not murdering or killing, but doing good in getting rid of such miserable wretches by perpetrating the butchery of such wicked people, and they need not feel any remorse or twinge of conscience. They could feel righteous because they were followers of God and were merely fulfilling the commandments and the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God, sarcasm. Now, onto some of the individual incidents of cruelty and barbarity in the genocidal massacre at Sand Creek in Colorado, as if I hadn't mentioned it enough. Here's one white soldier testifying at a later trial. They were scalped, their brains knocked out. The white men used their knives, ripped open women, especially pregnant women, clubbed little children, knocked them in the head with their guns, beat their brains out, mutilated their bodies in every sense of the word, worse mutilated than any I ever saw before. Children, 2 or 3 months old, all lying there from sucking infants to warriors. The orders by Colonel Shivington were simple. There were to be no prisoners, according to Mendoza in his Song of Sorrow, page 93. Another person, Robert Bent, writes, all the squaws in that hole were afterwards killed and 4 or 5 bucks outside. The squaws offered no resistance. Everyone I saw dead was scalped. I saw one squaw cut open with an unborn child lying by her side. A Captain Soul afterwards told me, that is Robert Bent, quote, that such was the case. I saw quite a number of infants in arms killed with their mothers, just like it says in 1 Samuel 15:3, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child. George Bent, a relative of Robert Bent, a mixed race, Cheyenne and white, writes, quote, what he and his Cheyenne companions witnessed on their run from the massacre was horrible. Old men, women, and children lying thickly scattered on the sand, some dead, and the rest too badly wounded to boo. Song of Sorrow by Patrick Mendoza. David Standard, in his book, American Holocaust, recounts an incident involving a small baby boy, infant. Quote, then as one of the cavalrymen later told it, while his compatriots were slaughtering and mutilating all the bodies of all the women and children they could catch, he spotted the boy trying to flee. There was one little child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead, and this little child was following after them. The little boy was perfectly naked, traveling on the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and draw up his rifle and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, let me try the son of a bitch. I can hit him. He got down off his horse, kneeled down and fired at the little child, but he missed too. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped. Soldiers, white US Euro-American soldiers, killing little kids, little babies, the 3-year-old kids, sucking infants. Amazing. This is an horrific example of human cruelty and indiscriminate savagery. When the morning first exploded into gunfire, White Antelope emerged from his lodge with his arms raised and shouted in English, "Stop, stop." But the carnage continued. When he realized it was hopeless, he stood tall and folded his arms and began to sing the Cheyenne death song. A lot of our peoples, especially on the plains, they have these songs that they sing when they know they're going to die. Although unarmed and 75 years old, White Antelope was shot down and killed. A white soldier dismounted from his horse and took out his knife. He then scalped the old chief. He also cut off White Antelope's nose, like the racist and white supremacist Andrew Jackson would do, cutting off the noses of the Muskogee men he had killed. And then along the genitals, along with ears and private parts, and bragged that he, the white soldier, was going to make a new tobacco pouch from the freshly severed genitalia, the penis and the scrotum. I wrote this part about the Sand Creek Massacre in 1975. It took me a while to write the book. I had a lot of procrastination too. After I had written about the Pequot Holocaust and the Wounded Knee Massacre, and I was profoundly affected by all the killing of our Indigenous peoples and by all the violence, brutality, torture, and savagery of the white soldiers. I was overwhelmed with feelings of anger, sorrow, and grief. Then when I read that White Antelope was 75 years old, and I realized that I too was 75 winters old at that time, I broke down and wept. And later on in that day, back in 1975, I resumed my writing. It was an emotional experience to write this book. I might add here that what I was feeling was anger and sorrow, overwhelming grief, resentment, hatred, bitterness, and a desire for vengeance. And as I learned from my studies, these feelings are appropriate emotional responses to enduring and also contemporary historical injustices. To continue the incidents of atrocities, one woman was lying whose leg had been broken by a shell. A white soldier came up to her with drawn saber. She raised her arm to protect herself when he struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over and raised her other arm when he struck, breaking it. Then he left without killing her. The white soldier left her to suffer with excruciating pain until she died. It's hard to interpret these events in any other way than that these atrocities, these heinous acts, and these crimes against humanity were perpetrated by devils directly from the pits of the white Christians' hell. One more example. With the active encouragement of their officers, the soldiers not only scalped the dead, but performed an altogether astonishing array of other mutilations, including the severing of male genitalia to be turned into tobacco pouches. When the bloodied 3rd Infantry returned to parade triumphantly down the streets of Denver, a short while later, the Coloradoan citizenry turned out to cheer them as they rode by, saving scalps and other such trophies, female genitalia stretched over hats and saddle pummels. For example, plainly in view from Lord Churchill, A Little Matter of Genocide, page 186. I just have to mention a genocidal massacre in California because, man, a whole lot of killing went on there too in California. Supposedly the Yahiana killed a steer, a white man's steer, because they were hungry. So in retaliation for this crime, there was an attack by settlers upon the native peoples. In this event, all of the Yahi-Yana people were killed. 33 Yahi were murdered and scalped at a cave north of Mill Creek by 4 whites led by Norman Kingsley. I have no idea where Mill Creek is. Kingsley, as quote, as he explained later, changed guns during the slaughter, encouraging his .56 caliber Spencer rifle for a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver because the rifle, quote, tore them up so badly, particularly the babies, unquote. I was absolutely amazed by the white man's compassion for the Yahi-Yani babies. Sarcasm. Ray, California. Vine Deloria writes, the gold fever in the 1860s and the miners. Quote, the miners embarked on a program of systematic genocide against the Indians of California, going so far to as Sunday shoots in which bands of whites, after celebrating in their Lord Jesus Christ, their Savior, in morning service, and then later on celebrating the killing of native peoples, Indians. Anyway, they would attack Indian villages, killing as many people as they could. Tribes were massacred to prevent them from holding their lands intact and out of reach of the gold-crazed miners. Final comments. Genocide of the indigenous peoples of what is now known as the United States of America is real. It began as early as 1492, when the first Western Europeans arrived in indigenous homelands in the indigenous hemisphere, which hemisphere is now known as the Americas, the North, the Central, and the South Americas. It began with the slaughter of 8 million native peoples in 21 years in the Caribbean. Dr. Martin Luther King, and I so thank this man for saying what I'm going to read. In regard to the beginning of the United States of America, Dr. King says, our nation was born in genocide. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to feel or reject remorse for this shameful episode. Dr. Martin Luther King, he is one of my heroes, more so than any white hero I learned about in school, more so than Washington or Jefferson or Jackson or Lincoln, et cetera, et cetera. As David E. Standard has pointed out in his American Holocaust, the Conquest of the New World, quote, just 21 years after Columbus's first landing in the Caribbean, the vastly populous island that the explorer had renamed Hispaniola was effectively desolate. Nearly 8 million people, those Columbus chose to call Indians. He invented that term, he coined that term and imposed it on us, and it has lasted these 529 years. And I know for myself, as one Dakota, old Dakota guy, I'm sick and tired of that term, Indians. And the US, and this violence continued on the mainland. Another 60 to 80 million First Nations people were murdered. And the US continues to wreak violence in the world in its quest for global dominance, implementing invasions, bombing, killing, stealing, occupying, and exploiting other peoples, especially those of color and their resources in the 20th and 21st centuries. As Deloria writes, quote, when one examines the history of US American society, one notices the great weakness in it. The country was founded in violence, it worships violence, and it will continue to live violently. Anyone who meets violence with love is crushed. But violence used to meet violence also ends abruptly with meaningless destruction. Yes, violence is US America's sweetheart. Violence is US America's sweetheart. As the US America continues to extend its power and control over weaker nations and to extend its empire, the indigenous peoples, not only of the United States, but also of the indigenous hemisphere, continues its struggle for physical and cultural survival and for recovery of pride and autonomy. We are still here, and we overcame genocide, the massive land theft of practically all of our indigenous homelands, practically almost 3 billion acres of land stolen from us and basically not paid for, broken treaties, all 400 plus treaties, suppression of our languages, the criminalization and suppression of our religious ceremonies and freedoms, bounties on our scalps, concentration camps, residential boarding schools, and an assortment of crimes against humanity perpetrated against us, et cetera, ad nauseum. And our struggle for freedom, human rights, land rights, water rights, hunting rights, and for dignity and respect will continue unabated. However, the above mentioned damning deeds have yet to be acknowledged and or admitted. They have yet to be taught in the schools, colleges, and universities, public and private. White scholars and academics who are both respected and are credible have to help us, the Native academics and writers and Native peoples. They have to start teaching the truth of what was done to the indigenous peoples. Because they are in the majority and they still make the decisions. And they have to start teaching the truth of what was done to the indigenous peoples who have known and experienced genocide and crimes against humanity since the white man arrived some 529 years ago, and who did it. According to Dr. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, we have, quote, a settlers society that has not come to terms with its past, whatever historical trauma was entailed in settling the land, unquote. And I thoroughly agree with the question she has raised for the future. That is, how then can US society come to terms with its past? How can it acknowledge responsibility? How? Henana epectedo. Yes, this is all I have to say. Wopida tonka oas echichiapedo. I extend my deepest appreciation to all of you. De taku epeki he hechetudo. Yes, what I have said is so. We are still here. We are still waiting. Mitakuye awasi, all my relatives.
Thank you, Dr. Mato Nunpa. Thank you so much for reading. I really appreciate you ending on that note in particular. We do have a few questions that folks have been sending in through your time while you've been talking. I know we're at the time that we had planned, but if you're okay to stay for a few more minutes, we could relay the questions. Is that okay with you?
That'd be fine.
Okay. Yeah, the first one very much aligned with the sentiment that you just shared. We're still here, we're on this land. The first question someone sent in is, it could be more rhetorical than literal, but how do we heal and repair ourselves and each other from this traumatic history? There's been so much genocide on this land, both of our indigenous and African ancestors. Well, and this may be open, for conversation with the group as well.
I have to say this right from the outset. In my old age, I'm now 81 winters, and I am very now pessimistic, cynical, skeptical, And I see what is happening today. And I know I'm ready to leave this time and place. So, and I'm not very hopeful that anything can be done. And like also with global climate change, I firmly believe that we have reached the point of no return. And I jokingly said yesterday in a Facebook post, so tomorrow, so we must eat, drink, we must then eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. I say that humorously. But having said all that, I'm not going to keep quiet. I'm going to keep saying these things. I'm going to keep writing my books. My second book is going to be titled Spirit Killing in the Classroom, a Dakota Youth's School Experience. And it's going to be about my personal experience in the Granite Falls Public Schools, Granite Falls, Minnesota. And it's going to be 12 years. The first year, 1947, I enter first grade. And the 12th year, 1959, I graduate. But it's about my personal experiences. And the narrative is told against a backdrop of colonialism, racism, white supremacy, racial hating, discrimination, then some curricular concerns that I have about what was taught there at the Granite Falls schools and some suggestions about what they should teach there instead of teaching what they're now teaching. And then the last, I quote, end the book with a number of comments, about a couple dozen comments by Dakota students who attended before my time, during my time, and after my time up to the year 2020, who tell about their experience with racism and discrimination and white supremacy. And their experiences are remarkably similar to what I talk about in this book that I'm going to be writing. I'm hoping it'll be published sometimes early next year. But I guess I'm willing to, I said this before in a previous Zoom expression or a Zoom presentation, and that is get educated, do some reading, and I'm willing to write a bunch of books or submit a list of books. If you contact me by email, I'll send them to you by email. Like I mentioned, certainly Vine Deloria Jr.'s book, God is Red, Custer Died for Your Sins, and a number of other books. And then, and he uses the word genocide. And then Dr. Russell Thornton, a Cherokee guy, he wrote a book about Americans' survival and Holocaust. And I'll send that to him. Also David Stannard's book, American Holocaust. Dr. Ward Churchill's book, A Little Matter of Genocide. And I'm going to even stick my book in there too. So, but there's a couple other books too, whose names I can't remember right now. But that's one thing I'm willing to do. Tell people, you know, if you really want to learn, then want to know, then read, and get yourself educated so you can help. You can help maybe facilitate a change if a change is to occur. And and maybe I hope I'm wrong on what I think. I hope my pessimism is not rewarded. And then parents, this is, if you got those out there listening, if you have kids in school, especially elementary kids, find out, what are they teaching you about Washington or Lincoln or Jefferson or Jackson or Theodore Roosevelt? What are they teaching you? What are they teaching about Christmas? What are they teaching about Easter? What are they teaching about holidays? Who gets holidays? Who makes holidays? You know, things like that. That right now, for us as Indigenous, I hear many of my Indigenous colleagues say, both college educated and non-college educated, say these things. So all these holidays, they're white man holidays. And so we have nothing to celebrate. And we certainly can't celebrate Independence Day. It's a day of mourning for us. Or we can't celebrate oppression because we're still living in oppression. We're still being colonized by the white man. Our colonizer has not left. A lot of colonizers in Africa, they have, the colonizing nations, they have left or kicked out of their country, but we got killed off. They killed us all. So we couldn't fight back anymore. But if we could have, if we had numbered in the millions upon millions, maybe we could have won and killed them. But they're here anyway. And so we live with that. And so anyway, I have very limited, I used to have a lot of answers when I was younger. Now I don't have much answers. And I have more questions than answers. I can probably give questions.
I mean, we would love to hear your questions. And I think there's another question that had come in kind of along the lines both of, you know, when you're speaking of holidays, like there are many people here, you know, whose peoples and holidays are like definitely not represented. You know, do we celebrate like Juneteenth? Do we celebrate like, you know,
and Martin Luther King?
Things,
celebrate Martin Luther King holiday.
But another question that came in, and this is also a comment, but first of all, I just want to thank you for bringing your daughter, Waziatawin, into the world. I, along with my students, have learned so much from her. Also, thank you so much for this talk. It's refreshing to hear direct, clear, and honest language. Speaking the truth and telling the truth is the first step towards healing. I was wondering, for those of us who are not white, but are benefiting from the theft of Dakota land by living here, what would a right relationship with this land and with the Dakota people look like?
Well, I would, I'll just mention some things that some of our young people are working on and that I used to work on, like to honor the treaties. There was a number of treaties made involving lands here in Minnesota. One is the 1805 treaty, our first treaty. Most of St. Paul and Minneapolis set on that land. And basically we have not been paid for that land. Zebulon Pike estimated the value of that, I don't know, a couple 100,000 acres of land at $200,000. And by that time, the Senate had learned all kinds of ways how to cheat Native peoples. And so the Senate, when the treaty got back to the Senate, they filled in there was 3 articles to it. The first article had to do with the building of the fort, and which they eventually did. They built Fort St. Anthony, which later became Fort Snelling. The second article had to do with consideration, which is payment. And instead of putting $200,000 in Article 2, they put $2,000. So we feel that they owe us $198,000 yet. And then the residents of St. Paul and Minneapolis owe us some back rent going back to 1805. You know, we say those things, but white people would pursue those claims. We can't. We don't have the money to hire lawyers. We get pro bono. One pro bono lawyer, he died now, so we can't depend on it. He was well known. Larry Leventhal was his name, a Jewish guy. He had empathy for us, and he comes from a group of people that suffered a whole lot of genocide and a whole lot of hate, and still suffer a whole lot of hate, as the Black people do as well. It's just it's terrible what our peoples of color have to go through in this country. And I hate the way, anyway, I better quit talking. Anyway, we're trying to, so honor the treaties. And like Treaty of 1851, one of my grandparents, I had in the Dakota US War of 1862 and the aftermath, I had relatives almost in every aspect of that war. I had relatives who fought against the United States and tried to drive them out of the Minnesota River Valley. But again, you know, we were outnumbered and outgunned, and then we were divided too. Christianity had divided us. So all the Christian Dakota didn't join with us, didn't help us at all. So, but I don't know that would have helped anyway, because we were really outnumbered by that time. So, but anyway, I had a relative who signed the first signatory on this 1851 treaty. He signed at Traverse to Sioux, St. Peter, involved 24 million acres of land, some of the best farmland in the world here in southern Minnesota. And we're not benefiting at all from it. And they haven't paid us for that. They didn't give us fair market value. They finally did a century later. Even I got in it. I think I got about $1,000. Maybe 10,000 of us got $1,000 each. And that is not, that is worth billions and billions of dollars, that land, 24 million. And the 54 million acres that Minnesota, that comprises the state of Minnesota, that's all of our homelands. We say Minnesota Makoche, land where the waters reflect the skies. And the state of Minnesota derives its name from our ancient name for this area. It's a reference to the thousands upon thousands of lakes that are in the north central region of what is now known as the United States of America. But it was primarily our homelands. Even the Anishinaabe people, they came about the same time as the white man did. But yet they stole some of our lands too. And so, and they with their guns, and we with our bows and arrows and our spears weren't no match for them with their guns. And we got driven out of northern Minnesota. So they got 7 reservations up there. But they were recent immigrants too, along with the white people. Anyway, so honor the treaties. And then we want to rename things. We'd like to rename Ramsey County, because I spent 7-8 years with the International Association of Genocide Scholars. I went all over the world giving lectures, presentations on the genocide of the Dakota people of Minnesota and the genocide of the Indigenous peoples of the US. Went all around the world. And I learned a lot about genocide from those people. I learned that what Alexander Ramsey did to us, all of those were acts of genocide. Yet the Minnesota's Ghoul Society, I call them that because they're fascinated by death. They're fascinated by human remains, especially of our remains, Dakota people. And so that's why I call them the Minnesota Ghoul Society, also known as their alias is Minnesota Historical Society. Yeah, but they have banned the term genocide, and they have banned the term concentration camp. So I'm hoping they change here, though. I'm really hoping that, and it's other peoples of color, non-Dakota, non-white, band together and start raising some hell, or raising some, how did John Lewis put it? Raising some good trouble. Yeah, raise some good trouble. I like it.
Thank you, Dr.
The battle cry. Raise some good trouble. Yeah.
There is one more question, Paige.
Okay.
I'll kick it to you. Do we have time, do you think? Or...
Yeah. So for the folks who are part of the longer boot camp this weekend, our next talk will be with Mary, and she's cool with us taking a little more time to make sure we get all of our questions, and we'll start that session a little later. Yeah.
Thanks, Paige.
Mhm.
Well, just one last thing, and I think this reflects on a lot of what you've shared today. And yeah, even talking about like current struggles with renaming, or with just everything that you've been learning. But the question is, what kind of self-care and self-love practices did you do while researching and writing this book? And I think this applies to the book that you're talking about next year. What kind of self-care and self-love practices did you do while writing and researching the book? The person who asked the question said Ibram X. Kendi, who studied over 500 years of racist thought and ideas in the world, ended up getting sick during his 4 to 5 year research. He got cancer. So
Yeah.
I'm curious how you took care of yourself as
No,
you read about all these
I'm
atrocities.
81 years. I've lived my life. It was when I reached 46 years of age, that would be in, let's see, well, I don't know, can't even add, but I thought, geez, yay, I reached 46 years old, because at that time there were studies showing that the average lifespan of the native male was 46 years of age because of violence, drunkenness, disease, especially diabetes. And so I made it that. And then the White Man's Bible in Psalms 90 says the natural lifespan is 70 years. So when I made 70 years, I thought, yay, I made it. I'm there. And now I'm 81 and I'm ready to go. But what do I do? Well, I keep busy doing what I'm doing, and I have to, sometimes I cry, cry a lot, shed tears. And I make jokes too, because depend on humor. To me, two things really got us Native peoples through this 529 years of abuse, violence, discrimination, white supremacy, racism, racial hating. It's been our humor and our ceremonies. Our ceremonies got us through. We get the spiritual strength to continue on and to fight. Even now I can feel the tears coming. So that's what I do. And I must tell the listeners too, to me, putting bounties on our scalps, stealing all of our lands, 3 billion acres, which now comprise the United States of America, breaking our treaties, suppressing our languages, criminalizing our religious ceremonies. To me, those sins are unforgivable. I can never forgive the United States and those horrible, evil people that did all these things to my people, the Indigenous peoples, and are doing it to other peoples of color as well, because they're so damn racist, racial hating. And they have these attitudes of white supremacy solidly embedded in their psyche. That's why I think they're not going to change. They are not going to change. I'm glad for the few people like Maria here. Maria Asp. And there's probably a couple dozen more like her, I think. But we have to reach a critical mass if change is going to occur. And we were not at that point. And that's why I think it's not going to happen. If it does, if things continue the way they are, maybe it could happen next century. But I think we're all going to be gone before the next century comes. So I don't have very good advice but for myself, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm going to keep writing my books. I might even read Dakota commentary on the Bible, selected aspects of their doctrines that they teach, and contrast it with the Dakota worldview, Dakota values, because we're as different as, it's like a big chasm between us, the Indigenous peoples of the Americas, and the white folk.
Thank you for sharing, Dr. Mato Nunpa, and I want to uplift what Laura said in the chat, that we'll carry your words and your truth with us. Two more things. One, we would love to know how to stay in touch with you. You know, you asked if people want a reading list, they could reach out to you. Whatever kind of contact information, maybe you could share with Maria and we could share.
Yeah, sure. Maria knows all my all my contact information, my address and my phone number and all that. So
Well, whatever you
my wife's
consent,
phone
whatever you
number
want to
has it.
share, it doesn't have to be all of it.
Yeah.
And then also Jayanthi, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Me?
I don't have a question, but I actually have something that I want to share and give to this wonderful brother, this wonderful elder, this wonderful uncle. I'm so thankful for your words today. And so I want to give you this small piece that you mentioned a little bit earlier. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, and there we wept, when we remember Zion. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, and there we wept, when we remember Zion. Oh, the wicked carry us away, captivity required from us a song. But how can we sing King Alpha's song in a strange land? Thank you so much for all your work and all the tears that carry you through to continue the work, all the acknowledgements, and all the education that you're continuing to provide. And I'm just very, very grateful to you and at your service if you need. Peace and blessings.
Thank you for that song. Beautiful.
Thank you. Paige, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, folks. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Chris, for being here. It is our honor, our pleasure. As Laura said, we will carry your words forward to all that we know and to our future generations as well. And folks, you can catch the recording. I'll make sure I send it out to everyone. And if you're attending the rest of boot camp, you can return to the Zoom link that we were in before. I sent it out to everyone in the email. So just go back to that same one. Any final words for us?
Thank you.
North America is a
she says North America is a crime scene.